Yeah, good morning, everybody. Welcome to Manthan on Sunday morning. Today we have a very special speaker, David Shulman, who's speaking to us from Jerusalem. Many of you would know uh, David Shulman's work on South Indian languages, especially his work on, I would call it a magnum opus called the Tamils. Besides that, he's worked on a number of other South Indian languages. But he's here today to talk about something else he's deeply concerned about. He's a member of a human rights group called the Taayush, which works in the West Bank. And he has been visiting the West Bank very often over the years, trying to protect the Palestinians who are living in the West Bank. So today he will talk about Israel, the occupation, and about democracy in Israel. David, we're very happy to see you with us, to have you here, and thank you for giving us time so early in the morning. The camera is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. I'm happy to be here with Manthan, and I think I'll just launch right into what I have to say. I'm nobody very important, actually, but I do have a long record of human rights activity in the occupied territories. I began working with Taayush, the organization just mentioned, in 2002. And what that means is that for all of these years, I've been very often in the West Bank, usually once a week, at least, sometimes more than that. And what we are trying to do is to somehow protect the Palestinian civilian population as best we can from Israeli settlers, from the army and the police and the whole occupation system. So I want to start by speaking about the situation today in what is called Area C of the West Bank. So you probably know, let me just be sure that you know that the West Bank has been divided into three areas, A, B, and C, under the Oslo agreements that were signed in the 90s. They were meant to provide a blueprint for a final settlement of the conflict and for the creation of a Palestinian state and the end to the Israeli occupation of the Palestinian territory. But that hasn't happened. Instead, what we have are Israeli settlements, Jewish settlements that are spread throughout the what is called Area C, which is under total Israeli control. Area A is under Palestinian Authority control. Everything, especially security matters. Area B is a mixed area of Israeli and Palestinian control. But all of the settlements, or nearly all of the Israeli settlements that have been placed in the heart of the Palestinian population centers, they're in Area C, which is 62% of the West Bank. In recent years, the settlement project, which is a colonial enterprise, has taken off and become far more violent and far more consequential. And the situation we have today is one of extreme settler violence backed up by the army and the police. So let me give you two or three examples. I like to talk on this kind of topic. I like to talk only about things that I myself have seen and experienced, or have heard directly from eyewitnesses who I trust to be reliable. So just let me give you two or three examples of how the situation is today. We've seen, first of all, an immense growth of settler outposts. They're called outposts. They're the veteran settlements, which are called settlements, but these outposts, they're usually inhabited by relatively small numbers of settlers. These are extremely violent people. Many of them are very young, adolescents who have been brainwashed. And these outposts have been set up in order to, basically in order to steal the land. They have herds of goats and sheep, and they use these herds to invade the Palestinian grazing grounds and fields, and then take them over for themselves. We don't know for sure, but there's somewhere between 100 and 150 of these outposts that are now spread all over Area C. So what happens now? Let's take the case of a small village called Zimba, which is in the very southern end of the West Bank. Palestinian village, I know the village well. So just a few days ago, I think it was on Friday night, there was a settler raid on the village. The settlers come in, they're armed with guns and clubs, and they break whatever they can break: doors, windows, water tanks, solar panels. And they also beat people up, and sometimes they shoot at them. We have video footage from what happened to Chinba the other night. By the end, said that you have to understand that these are extremely violent people. Not all Israeli settlers are violent. We are talking about the kind of fringe unit, but that includes, we don't know for sure, several thousand young people who have been brainwashed. So they attacked the people with their clubs and the guns. The result was that one teenage boy was left with intracranial bleeding. He's still in the hospital. It's not clear if he'll survive. Another Palestinian has fractures to his skull. Another one, the broken arm. There's another one with a broken rib, and I don't remember what happened to the fifth one. And there were other people, of course, who were beaten as well. As if that were not enough, we're talking about, by the way, a large group of settlers. We are somewhere in the realm of maybe 30, maybe 40 armed settlers. As if that were not enough, later that night, a much bigger group, 100 and some people came, many of them in army uniform. That's because the army and the police in the occupied territories have been entirely integrated with the settlers. There's no longer any perceptible difference whatsoever. So they came in the middle of the night. They had these heavy hammers, and they went into every house in the village, and they used their hammers to break down everything that they possibly could, including the refrigerators, if there were any. They also dumped whatever reserves of food were there, dumped them on the ground. You have to remember, this is Ramadan. It was Ramadan time, so I mean, that only 2 meals a day. And anyway, these are poor people living on the margin of extreme poverty. And there were arrests, of course. That's the other thing, is that they normally arrest Palestinians. The settlers who are doing this, or the soldiers who are perpetrating this kind of violence, are never arrested. They're above the law. Israeli law does not apply to Jewish settlers on the West Bank. I mean, in theory it does, but in practice it does not. So that's Jimba. The prototype, something that I myself have heard more than once, and it's what happened in nearly all the villages that I know in the Jordan Valley. In recent years, I'm most active in the Jordan Valley, although for many years I was working in the South Hebron Hills, the southern chunk of the West Bank. I think all of the villages that I know have seen the following scene. It's close to what I just described, but sometimes worse. What happened when the war broke out in October of 20, 23, sorry. So we had settler attacks, usually large bodies of settlers. They would come into the village carrying their guns. Some of them had guns. They also had knives. Sometimes they had pistols. Sometimes they had machine guns. Once again, they would enter all of the houses, create havoc. Sometimes they would shoot the sheep or shoot the goats. They would shoot holes in the water tanks. You need water. It's a dry, arid area. You need water there in order to survive. They'd break the solar panels. They'd beat people up, and they would threaten them. This was maybe the worst of it all. They would say to them, you have 24 hours to leave. If you're still here, we'll be back tomorrow at this time. If you're still here, we will kill all of you. That means men, women, and children. There is no village in Area C, to my knowledge, that has not heard this kind of threat and experienced that kind of invasion, sometimes several times. So you can imagine that the Palestinians living in this area, they're at the mercy of the settlers and they're terrified. They're living in a kind of state terror or state-driven terror, because these settlers, although they're, you could say, the vanguard of the whole operation, they are working under the aegis of the present Israeli government, which is an extreme right government. And their goal, there's no question about it, their goal is ethnic cleansing in Area C, or at least initially in Area C, where we have several 100,000 Palestinians living in villages. The long-term goal is to drive all Palestinians out of the West Bank and Gaza. So that means something of the order of about 5 million people. The goal is ethnic cleansing and the annexation of these territories, annexation to Israel. And, you know, I said a minute ago that the army and the police are complicit in this. They're not simply complicit, they're actively part of it. That did not used to be the case to the same extent. The army and the police were never very much on the side of the human rights activists or of the Palestinians, but they were at least sometimes relatively neutral. We could call, there was a time when we were able to call the police or the army and they would come, if we were being attacked, and they might appear. That's no longer possible when they've been welded into a single body, and they are supported by important critical sections of the government and the Knesset, the parliament. I'll have more to say about that later. These young settlers who commit these crimes, usually they're indoctrinated with a kind of messianic or apocalyptic ideology. They think that the war of Gog and Magog is about to happen. They think that's a good thing because it allows them to dream of expelling the entire Palestinian population. As I said earlier, first from Area C, then from the rest of the West Bank. And these are fanatical and extremely violent people. I want to give you another example of how this works. The invasions of the villages, that's one mechanism, but there are also other equally severe problems. For example, the village where I most often find myself these days, I sleep there. We sleep in the villages as a kind of protection, some kind of minimal deterrent. So there's a village called Ras El Ain. It's a large village in the Jordan Valley. Actually, it's a conglomeration of 3 separate villages which came together because they knew they had to somehow act together in order to try to defend themselves. There's a stream coming out of a beautiful spring up in the hills. This stream is carried through an aqueduct, which I think is quite old. It may go back as far as medieval times or even earlier than that. The village gets its water from this stream. So what that means is, this is, again, I want to say it's a desert. And it's also extremely hot, by the way, in the hot season. The temperatures go up to 45 and 50 every day. The water is brought in small tankers connected to tractors, and the Palestinians come early in the morning, around 4:30 in the morning, in order to fill up the water. 4:30 before dawn, and the hope is that no settlers will turn up to try to harass them. And then again, they come around 4 o'clock or 5 o'clock in the afternoon to fill up the tanks, and that's always enough water for a single day. But the settlers from these outposts in the area, and by now there are several, they do whatever they can to prevent these people from getting water. They want to dry them out. So what normally happens, I've seen it myself many times, is that these settlers arrive at, say, in the afternoon time, 5 o'clock in the afternoon, 4:30, 5 o'clock. They surround the tankers and won't let them move. They block their way. Sometimes they cut the pipes that are used to take water from the stream. Often they cut the pipes that are meant to bring water directly into the village and are on the ground. And they also like to beat up the Palestinian drivers who are coming there to take the water. And if there's any problem for them, they will call in the police or the army. The police might come. If they do come, they will invariably arrest the Palestinians or us, the peace activists, the human rights activists. The settlers are never arrested, as I said before. So here's a village. It's a big village. I don't know the exact number of people who live there. They live off of their sheep and goats. It's a village of at least some 400 or 500 people. They've been there for a long time, by the way. The idea is to drive them out. And depriving them of water is one very effective instrument of doing that. Something very dramatic happened in this village on the 3rd of March, the night of the 3rd of March. So these are shepherds. They live off of the sheep and the goats. They cannot survive without the milk of the sheep and the goats. That's their major lifeline. That and the water, of course. So on the night of March 3rd, if I remember correctly, there was a massive raid on the village by combined forces of these Israeli settlers, the police who led the raid into the village, and the army. So what happened was that the settlers, they have a kind of maneuver, we've seen it many times. They bring their own herds into the village and they mingle them with the Palestinian herds, and then they claim that the Palestinians have stolen sheep or goats from them. And that's what happened that night. And the result was that they then went from sheepfold to sheepfold and simply stole all of the sheep of Ras Elaim. They, in the course of that night, under the surveillance of the army and the police, they drove away something like 1,500 sheep. In other words, they emptied the village of its sheep. Again, I want to say that's their lifeline in the village. They drove the sheep. Some of them they put in trucks and drove them off. Most of them, they drove them uphill into the hilly country where they mingled them with their own sheep. And now somewhere between 1,000 and 1,500 sheep have been lost. There's virtually no hope that they'll get these sheep back. Actually, a kind of dramatic thing happened. Two of our activists went looking for some of these stolen sheep. They found some. They found them in the hill country. It's an area which is absolutely saturated with these new outposts. So it's a violent area and it's dangerous, but they went in there on motorcycles and they found a cave in which there were large numbers of sheep, including sheep that were taken from Ras Elaim. You know, the Palestinians, they mark the sheep on their ears. They have a particular way of marking them as a kind of symbol of ownership. So they took pictures of them. They went to the village. The owners of the sheep immediately identified which sheep were there. Then there was a question of what to do. This was, it was a herd of sheep that was living in a cave. We couldn't call the police because the police were complicit in the whole business. You can't call the army for the same reason. The question was how to act. In the end, we brought journalists, including some foreign journalists, to the cave. They took their pictures and they saw what had happened. They were then attacked by the settlers who blocked the vehicles and wouldn't let them out. And it was kind of scary for a little while. Eventually, the police did arrive and broke the blockade. And one of the policemen said to a friend of mine, he said, well, why didn't you call us? You know, if you found this, why didn't you call us? We're the police. What can one say when the police are the people who are actually doing this kind of crime? There's a big question now as to whether this village can survive at all. Without the sheep, even if they manage to get back a few sheep there now, when I was there just a week ago, there was a remnant of maybe something like 20 or 30 sheep left in this village. It's not clear how they're going to survive. These are not people who have reserves of savings or cash. They don't have that. Their water supply is endangered. The sheep are gone. The settlers are at their throats. And it's quite possible that they will simply pick up and leave. You might ask me where they will go. So far, something like 25, 26 villages in the Jordan Valley and in the South Hebron Hills, and to some extent in the middle of the West Bank, central West Bank, in the area that's called the Taiba Junction. 25, 26 villages have already been driven out, expelled by the settlers. They're unable to survive under these conditions of constant harassment and violence. I was in a beautiful village called Ein Samia, on the day that the very last of their trucks left with the few possessions that they were able to salvage. This was after months of severe harassment and violence, and people were hurt, of course. I saw the last truck drive off. It was a heartrending experience, I can tell you. It was a beautiful village, good people. They had a school. All villages have schools. And in fact, I think I can say from experience that I've never seen communities so committed to educating their children as these Palestinians on the West Bank. But these schools are usually targeted by the settlers, and that was true at this village of Ein Samia. They destroyed the school. Anyway, I saw them leave. You know, you have to understand, I'm Jewish. My forefathers presumably underwent experiences like that, perhaps multiple times, in Europe over centuries. And it's somehow in our blood. We know what it means to be driven out of your home. And I know what it means, and I can tell you that it's a heartrending thing to see those trucks drive off and to see the village emptied out and taken over by the settlers. Where do they go? In the case of Ein Samia, they went to a kind of rocky, arid hill in Area B, which, as I said earlier, is under joint Palestinian and Israeli control. I don't think there are any settlements in Area B, but unfortunately, they're very close to the border of Area C. The settlers don't care about the borders. These people from Ein Samia, they're very close to a particularly virulent settlement, and I'm not sure they'll be able to survive there. And also, it didn't look to me as if there was any land any grazing grounds that would be able to sustain the sheep. Sometimes they go to families these are often tribal organizations, as these tribes are spread throughout the West Bank. So sometimes villages that have fled, they end up with some of their distant relatives in some other place, could be farther south in the West Bank, could be in the Jordan Valley. Some of them have moved now multiple times, and they have no protection and no recourse. There's also no legal recourse. You know, you would think perhaps if a village lost 1,500 of its sheep, might think they would be able to take the army, the police, and the settlers to court and perhaps find some legal solace. But in fact, that's impossible. It won't happen anymore. In fact, you're not going to be able to find, I think you won't be able to find a single honest army officer or a single decent policeman anywhere in the occupied territories today. You might ask yourselves what we can do to help. And in a way, it's not very much. I have a friend in one of the villages in South Hebron. And, you know, when we started sleeping in the villages at the time of the war, this friend of mine said to me something very true. He said, it's very nice that you're here. We really appreciate the fact that you're coming, but you can't really protect us for 3 reasons. One is that you have no weapons. 2 is that even if you had weapons, you would never use them. And 3, if they begin to beat you up, you don't fight back. And that's true. We're Gandhian style peaceful resistors, peace activists. We believe in civil disobedience in the Gandhian manner. That also means that all of us are occasionally arrested, and there's all kinds of problems that you can easily imagine. We do provide some sense of solidarity with these people so that they're not entirely left alone. Because really the worst of the whole situation is that they're isolated and alone and without any possible recourse. And that loneliness, which I know very well from long experience, that loneliness is a terrible thing. Helplessness, impotence, and loneliness. We're there at least to be with them, and I often feel that that's the one thing that we can truly do. We can be with them in their suffering. We've had some success over the years in land claims, but that was some years ago when the Israeli courts, the civil courts, were still capable of adjudicating these cases where lands have been stolen by the settlers. For a while, we had quite a lot of successes. These are small-scale successes, but that's no longer the case. Now the courts are no longer of any use to us, and we're living in an ongoing situation of state terror in Area C. So I could go on like this forever because there are literally hundreds of villages that are in the same situation as what I've just described. But I want to talk a bit about the, let's call it the political concomitants of this kind of a situation. So actually, there's a kind of triangle. On the one hand, we have the attempt to empty the West Bank of its Palestinian inhabitants. That's, as I said a minute ago, that's driven by the extreme right-wing people in the government. This is a very right-wing government. But the second vector of the triangle is the government's attempt to destroy the democratic structure of the state. So I'll try to put this as succinctly as I can. Even before the war broke out on October 7th, this government, Netanyahu's government, they had already embarked on a campaign in the Knesset, in the parliament, which would have more or less destroyed the entire legal system of the country, and especially the Supreme Court, the High Court of Justice. They regard, that is, people like Netanyahu and the people around him, they regard the Supreme Court as a horrible nuisance, which is at times stopping them from doing the kinds of things they want to do. And what they want to do is to replace the democratic structure with a kind of dictatorship. If you want a softer word, you can call it an authoritarian government, like we see in places like Turkey and Hungary. But I think it's actually more to the point to talk about a dictatorship. So what that means is that first you have to destroy the legal system. Then you have to turn the police into a political tool in the hands of the government. There's no longer an impartial police force in Israel. Police force is under the direction of a man called Ben Gvir, who is the most extreme of all the extremists. He's a very violent person. So he's transformed the police into a kind of organization that does things like witch hunt Israeli activists and Palestinians, of course. They're trying to do the same thing to the army. Netanyahu has already gutted the civil service. That is, he's removed the people who were professionals there, all of the major offices. That is the Treasury, of course, the legal advice of the government, everything that applies to infrastructure, social services, all of that. He's replaced these people with sycophants and lackeys. They're usually ignorant, have no idea what they're meant to do, and the result is that the civil service has more or less collapsed. He's now trying to rid himself of the legal advisor, the attorney general of the country. There's a very courageous woman. Her name is Miara Biara, and Bahara Miara, sorry, and she so far is standing up to the government and trying to preserve some semblance of the old legal system. And Netanyahu is now trying to fire her. The thing will come up before the Supreme Court, which is still miraculously functioning on some level. Initially, before the war, there were mass protests in Israel against what was happening. And we did manage to stop temporarily the attack on the Supreme Court by very large-scale demonstrations. There were literally millions of Israelis in the street. In India, that might not sound like very many people, but in Israel, it's a country of something like 8 million, 9 million people. If you have 1.5 million people in the streets, it's a really major achievement. So we managed to stop this assault upon the Supreme Court temporarily, but now it's wartime. Wartime changes the situation in the population. So now what we're seeing are a whole series of anti-democratic laws which are meant to destroy the whole fabric of the democratic system in Israel and to replace it with some kind of authoritarian dictatorship. You might ask, how is this possible? Israel was on the whole inside of the old Israel, inside of what's called the Green Line, that is the boundary of the 1967 war. It was a kind of democracy, a functional democracy, not a perfect one, but at least within the Green Line, there was a system of justice, and there were normal elections, and there were police who did their job, and the army was not politicized. They're trying to destroy all of that. How did it happen that this became possible? So to put it very simply, I have to simplify. The country has really been divided into two major blocks. It's about half and half. There's half of the country which is still committed to liberal ideas and to the democratic system. So who are those people? They tend to be the old secular Israelis, many of them from Eastern Europe or from Central Europe, people who have emigrated to Israel over the years, and also the Arab population, because that's 20% of the state. The other half of the country These are people, there's a demographic area here. These are people, Israel, I have to say, it's a very diverse population. The electorate is very diverse. So we have about 20 to 25% of the country who are people who come from a different political culture. They don't know about liberal democracy. They come from the Arab countries, Iraq, North Africa, Tunisia, Morocco. Some come from Turkey. They've been in Israel for decades, many decades. And on the whole, they don't have the kind of perception that we might have about democracy. They think that democracy is majoritarian rule without any obstacles or hindrances. So these people, many of them, not all of them, many of them, they're completely in love with Netanyahu, and they regard him as a kind of charismatic king, and they'll take anything that he does as the word of God. So that's 25% of the population. Then you have the religious Zionists. They have a religious ideology. These are the people who really kidnap the state and its organizations. And they think that the Messiah is going to come and that the whole of the land belongs to the Jews and only to the Jews. They're a rather small part of the population, perhaps 10%. But together with the, what shall I say, the extreme right parties, which were once outlawed by the Knesset because they're racist and totalitarian, Netanyahu re-legitimized them. They now exist in the Knesset. So together, this gives them a lot of electoral clout. And then you have the ultra-Orthodox people. You have the ultra-Orthodox people. These are not just ordinary modern religious Zionists. These are people who are living in the world of Jewish law as it was understood in Poland 500 years ago. They don't serve in the army. They live off of state stipends. They and they have major parties in the Knesset which hold the balance of power. That adds up to this division in the electorate. So let's say you have roughly half of the country which is still committed to democracy and is fighting for it in the streets now with mass demonstrations. And you have the other half which is quite prepared to go along with any attempt to demolish the democratic system. And in the case of the ultra-Orthodox, they're there in order to basically to rob the treasury of these immense sums, billions of dollars that the government gives them in order to have their support in the coalition. That's the second vector of the triangle, and I just want to say a few words about the third vector. We had, by the way, just to give you some sense of what this means in political terms, we had 4 elections over 5 years because each one of the elections until the last one ended in a kind of stalemate. It was impossible for anybody to set up a viable coalition. In the last election in November of 22, Netanyahu came out on top, but by a kind of electoral fluke. I don't want to go into the details. Really, the electorate remains divided in two. But he was able to put together a government with the aid of all these extremists, and that's the situation we have today. The third angle of this is the question of what will happen to the Palestinians. Because, when the peace movement began in Israel in the late 1970s, that was the time after the October War of 1973, when President Sadat came to Israel in order to make peace. At that time, the Israeli peace movement was born, and it was initially very successful. In a way, it set the agenda for Israeli governments for the first few decades after the peace with Egypt. And perhaps the most important thing that the peace movement did in those years was to identify the partner for peace. Because, until the late 1970s, the early 80s, Israeli governments tended to think that if there was ever going to be peace, it would be peace with the Arab states, and the Palestinians didn't really matter. But, today there are these two peoples in the land of Palestine and Israel, west of the Jordan River, and the populations are more or less at parity. There are Palestinians and there are Israelis. These two peoples have got to somehow find a way to live together if there's ever going to be peace, if the country is going to survive at all. The peace movement identified the Palestinians as our true partners in making peace. And it worked for a while, and we had the Oslo agreements, but other things happened. I don't think this is the time to go into the history. The Israeli electorate has taken a major step towards the right. The extreme right is now in power, and the idea is to maintain a kind of apartheid system on the West Bank in which there's Jewish supremacy, the Jews will control all the land, and Palestinians will be hemmed into these small enclaves, discontinuous enclaves, with no human rights whatsoever. You cannot have a democracy in which one group has all the normal human rights, more or less, and the other group has none. It won't work. And although this is the program of the present government, I think what it means in the long run is if we don't manage somehow to bring the occupation to an end and make peace with the Palestinian people, a real peace, a viable peace based on equality, if we're unable to do that, the state of Israel will not survive. I just want to say one last thing and then I'll stop. It's situation in the West Bank, as I said to you, it's terrible. Situation within Israel is extremely volatile and dangerous. But to me, at least, perhaps the worst of the whole sordid scene is the fact that it is now Israel that is betraying the classic Jewish values, the values of the Jewish tradition, Jewish civilization going back some 3,000 years. You may know, I think you probably know, the Jews are the people who actually invented the idea of human rights, of equality, of loving one's neighbor, of some form of regulating the world so that you don't have constant crime, some notion of freedom of speech. It happened already in the Bible, and in the 19th century, or late 19th, early 20th century, it was Jews who created what we now call the Bill of Human Rights that have been accepted by liberal societies throughout the world. To me, to see those classic values of the Jews betrayed and desecrated by our own government and by our army and by the police and of course by the settlers, to see that as heartbreaking experience. I don't know if we'll recover from this situation. I think it's possible that those values may yet emerge on top. But I grew up in a small town in the Midwest in Iowa. My mother, who was she was a religious woman, not in an Orthodox way, but she taught us. She used to say, we Jews, we were slaves in Egypt. That's what the Bible says. We were slaves in Egypt. And this week is the holiday of Passover, in which we celebrate our freedom from slavery. My mother used to say, we were once slaves. We Jews, we know what it means to be a slave. And because of that, we will never, ever enslave another people. And we will be with the people who are most in need, the oppressed, the minorities, the weak. We will stand with them because that is the essence of our civilization. You know, I grew up with that. I guess that's why I'm now an activist in the territories. And I'd like to think that perhaps someday those values will reemerge and the Israel will heal itself. At the moment, we're betraying those values. I think I'd better stop there.
Thank you, David, for your chilling description of what's happening there. And yet, scholarly, it's not easy to say what you've said. There are many questions, but the first question I have to you is you said that some of these settlers were fanatics. How is this fanaticism fed? Is it indoctrination? Is it, I mean, how did it start? How do these people become fanatics?
Yeah. So, so the settler movement began in the 1970s, the mid-1970s. There were very few people involved in it, a few thousand at most. They had the idea of Greater Israel. That is, they wanted to settle the land. It's a kind of colonial adventure, settle the land and take it entirely for the Jews. And these were mostly religious people. I do have to say that many of these settlers in those years, the early years, the mid-70s, 80s, and 90s, when the veteran settlements were established, many of them were just ordinary people, some of them secular people who they were induced by government subsidies to buy houses in these new settlements at a very low rate of mortgages. So they created what were called quality of life settlements. That is, they settled close to the Green Line, very close to the Israeli population centers in Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, and Haifa, and so on. They were not ideological settlers, many of them. But the ideological ones, and I don't know how many of them they were certainly at that time, well, over the years, they became tens of thousands. Today, there are close to 500,000 settlers on the West Bank. If there are, let's say, 3 million Palestinians there, we have close to half a million Israeli settlers there. Now, among them, you have these people in the outposts. They're a different group. They've been indoctrinated, I think it would be fair to say brainwashed by their elders. You have a lot of disturbed adolescent youth. Many of the outpost settlers that we meet are, adolescents. They're 16, 17, 18 years old. They're carrying guns now. I'm not sure they know how to use those guns, but they've been picked up off of the streets, by the settlers who've made a concerted effort to conscript these people to the settler cause. So you have, I don't know how many people like that. Perhaps there are only a few tens of thousands, I don't know. They're the people that I tend to meet out in the field. And they're extremely fanatical. It's not just a fanaticism. It comes with this entire kind of theology of total Jewish supremacy, the fact that God himself gave the land to the Jews and only to the Jews. It's a kind of racist vision because Palestinians are not considered human. And these are the violent people that I was talking about.
David, there are many questions, some of them relating to Gaza. We'll kind of try to make them general. One question, you talked about the division of Israeli society among different groups. One question is related to that. Is that given the history that the European immigrants have experienced, are they more sensitive to the conditions of the Palestinians as against the American Jews who may have emigrated or have dual citizenship? Are they the ones also driving state policy, and are they more influential in deciding, what the state acts towards the Palestinians?
So, it's an ethnic conflict, and we're talking about an ethnic nationalist state. So that has all kinds of ramifications, because even if we think, as I do think, that half of the population is still committed more or less to the liberal program and to human rights and to democracy, even if we take that as a given, we still have the fact that this is people, especially in wartime, they tend to see the Palestinians as their enemies. And in fact, there are real enemies. That's, I mean, there's no question about it. The Hamas, they're a terrorist organization, a very brutal one. And the Hezbollah in Lebanon, they're also, these are true enemies. But the Palestinian mainstream, and certainly the people that I'm with, and I'm with Palestinians every week, they don't fit into that stereotype. But the stereotype exists, and it exists within the Israeli community, including among people who we would think would be normally on the side of making peace. There's a lot of resentment, bad feeling towards Palestinians in general, and towards the Palestinian Authority in particular, because I think it's fair to say, I'm sorry to have to say, that the Palestinian Authority, which is the one body of Palestinians that has some kind of international recognition, it's extremely inefficient and quite corrupt. Everybody knows that, and Palestinians will be the first to say it. So you can see that it's a complicated thing. My neighbors on the street in the neighborhood that I live in, if I were, to talk to them about Palestinians, they would say, oh, Palestinians, they're a disaster. We'll never be able to make peace with them. They're all terrorists or something like that. It's true that I suppose the population, the Jewish population that came from Europe or from the States, but that was in most cases many years ago, decades ago. It's still true to say that these are people who are much more committed to the older vision of a democratic state, and who also supported the peace movement during the time of the Oslo agreements.
The question from Sujata on why are the civil societies and citizens in Israel, why don't they raise their voice against these criminal acts? How come Netanyahu is still popular? And do you see any parallels in this and what's happening in India?
Yeah. The civil society in Israel is raising its voice. The thing is that we don't have the means so far by popular protests to bring down the government. We were very close to it before the war broke out, when there were these massive demonstrations against the attempt to destroy the Supreme Court. Even now, the last little while, we've been seeing large-scale demonstrations. For us, these are large-scale. If you have 100,000 people or 150,000 people demonstrating outside the Knesset in Jerusalem, that's a major event. But Netanyahu has a parliamentary majority for the reason that I said, because he re-legitimized the Kahanist extremists, and he has the religious nationalists, and he's prepared to bribe the ultra-Orthodox parties by giving them these enormous subsidies. So he has a parliamentary majority of about 68 out of 120. So far, we've been unable to bring the government down. And the only way I think that we'll be able to do it, I think it's possible that we will be able to do it, would be nationwide strikes, which would close down the economy entirely for days, for an unlimited period. That would do it. And it's also possible that as Netanyahu's legal troubles continue to escalate, there's a whole new business relating to people who were working closely with him in his office and who were apparently, well, that's the suspicion, they were apparently on the payroll of the Qataris. It's possible that the government will eventually collapse over these things. And Netanyahu is in the court on charges of bribery and breach of trust. But for the moment, he has a secure coalition. And I don't know if we'll be able to achieve what has been happening in Serbia and in Georgia and in Poland and in other such places. I'm not sure that we'll be able to do it. On a good day, I think that we will eventually get rid of this government, and there will be elections. But you know, there's a real danger now. All of us feel this. There's a real danger that if this so-called reform of the legal system goes through and the anti-democratic legislation is approved and the Supreme Court doesn't, delegitimize it, it's quite possible that there will never again be free elections in Israel. Netanyahu would be happy to do without elections, or there could be elections that are kind of, fake elections that are dominated by the police, like in Russia and other places like that. We're very afraid that that could happen. He, I think, has no, no intention of, I mean, he would happily go along with destroying the idea of free elections.
David, this sounds eerily very familiar, but let's leave that aside. What I wanted to ask you was, the war has gone on for now 18 months. Many young soldiers have served and many atrocities have been committed. You were talking about the extreme, the settlers, some of the youngsters being extremists and being brutalized. Do you see signs of the war itself having brutalized Israeli society? The reservists who served there, what they have seen, what they have done, have come back, and that makes it even more difficult to see a change in the future.
Yeah. It's a very brutal war, and you're right, there are atrocities. We know that there are war crimes. We're seeing these days there's a movement in Israel today of young soldiers who are refusing to go back into the war. The war is ongoing. They've, after all, restarted the war. That in itself is a foolish idea because we still have these hostages in Gaza. And that's before we even get into the question of the immense casualties among the Palestinians. And this war, Gaza war that's going on now, it seems to have no purpose and no strategy and nothing but more and more violence and death. It does brutalize some of the soldiers, I think, but we're hearing soldiers now who are refusing to present themselves for service and actually announce it publicly in the newspapers. So that's a problem. I mean, in Israel, these are Israel's lived off of its army since the very beginning, and there's a kind of militarism that's built into the ethos of the society. For a young Israeli or Israeli reserve soldier to say that he's not going to serve, that's a personal decision. Nobody has the right to say to anybody that they must not serve. But there are more and more people who are taking that decision and publicly announcing it. You know, in the army units that are now serving in Gaza, many of them have less than a 50% representation of their soldiers. That is, half of the units have refused to come back to the war. So, the government may want to produce a kind of situation of eternal war. It looks like that's what they want. It's good for the coalition. But it's not sure that the army is capable of doing that if they don't have the manpower to pursue it.
You used the word apartheid in spoke about it. And I remember that one of the reasons why finally apartheid was dismantled in South Africa was international pressure.
Yeah.
And there were cultural boycotts, there were sports boycotts, there was economic boycotts. And
Yes.
the European nations and America also participated in the dismantling of the apartheid. What has changed? Why do they treat this problem differently?
We're in a new reality with Trump. And before Trump was elected, the Americans did have some kind of cloud, and they were a kind of brake on what Israel was doing in the West Bank. They even banned individual settlers whom they knew were violent and criminal. They didn't do enough in that direction, but it's not only a question of the Americans. I mean, the European, too, there's the International Court of Justice in The Hague. So in the old days, before Trump, we used to think that our salvation might well come from the outside, from international pressure. Israel was very sensitive to international pressure over the years. But now we have a new situation because, Netanyahu is riding high. He thinks that Trump will support anything he wants to do. Europeans are struggling to maintain some kind of semblance of solidarity among themselves under these new conditions. We still try to publicize. I myself, I write these blog posts that are published all over the world, and in the sense that the hope that some kind of international pressure still exists and might have some effect upon what is happening in the West Bank. But at the moment, the situation looks very grim. And I suppose, like in these other places that I mentioned, say Poland, the answer has to come from within the Israeli people. They have to make the change. It won't be easy. There's a danger of civil war.
Yes.
Maybe there'll be elections after all one of these days. I don't know. Hey, by the way, Netanyahu is not popular. It's a mistake to think that he's popular. At least if you go by the polls, 70% of the population very much want him out of office.
David, I think we're running out of time. Just to the audience, David has a class to take, so he's very generously given us time early morning. Just a couple of more questions, David. One is from a member of the audience. You spoke about 50% of Israeli society still wanting peace with Palestinians. Has that changed in the past 18 months? Has the idea of against the very idea of Palestine grown, or is there the opposite? I mean, are people against, is it even possible to think, you are hopeful that things will change eventually, but is it, are we reaching a state of no return where Israeli society itself is not willing to consider the idea of Palestine? The second is, you were talking about reservists not serving. That is unimaginable, in what is supposed to be a dictatorship, in the sense that, any country in a war, you have to serve. And we also have things like newspapers like Haaretz. I mean, maybe an exception, but it seems to be a mixture of, extreme violence as well as a little bit of space here and there to express yourself. Sorry, two different questions in a way. Yeah.
Yeah. Wait, you have to remind the second question. I liked your formulation very much. You have to remind me of the first question.
Is it Israeli society increasingly against the very idea of Palestine?
There's unquestionably some falling away from the idea that we have to make peace with the Palestinians. They're the key to any kind of peace, any regional peace, actually the key to the survival of the state. There's an attrition because, first of all, the Hamas atrocities on the 7th of October, that's for Israel, they killed something like 1,500 people. For Israel, that's a huge number of people, and no question that there's no question that the atrocities that were committed by the Hamas has had a traumatizing effect on the public in general. And there are a lot of people who today would say, we can't make peace with these people. It's impossible. Just look what they're doing to us. There are a lot of people like that. And we're also stuck with the problem that the Palestinian Authority is mostly ineffectual, although Israel has a part in that. Israel deliberately, you could say, reduced the power of the Palestinian Authority in order to divide the Palestinians into these two camps, Gaza and the West Bank. So that's another problem because, we need to hear the Palestinian voices that would be in favor of peace. And we have such people. I mean, I myself, I know lots and lots of Palestinians who want peace. These shepherds that I spend my weeks with, they just want to live their life, and they understand that peace has to come, but they want a peace that involves a kind of normalcy and equality. Wartime polls, opinion polls, are often not very reliable. So as long as the war is going on, I think there'll be a lot of anti-Palestinian sentiment in Israel. But eventually, I think that may well change. I liked what you said, at the end. There are spaces, there are still very significant spaces in Israel of resistance to the government, to the anti-democratic program, and to the war. I was at a demonstration last night. There were thousands of people here in Jerusalem at this demonstration. These are people who are against the war. It reminds me to some extent of my childhood in Iowa when the Vietnam War was still in progress, and there was massive civil society protest, which eventually succeeded. It's not impossible that that will happen here. It's not impossible. I mean, we face a major challenge. So far, we've not been able to bring down the government. I think a moment may come when we will be able to do that. Israel is a very volatile place and very dramatic things happen. Some of them are terrible and horrible. Some of them are still very much in the older tradition. Israel is fighting for its life, if you think its life is somehow connected to the fact of it being a democracy, and also in the hope of making peace. Yeah, I still think it's about half and half. And half is not so bad. Yeah.
I have one question from the audience. It says that, do you think then we have Hamas, the wrong representative of the Palestinians, that kind of extremism? What do you think of Hamas and the support they get from Iran or other Arab states? And is that the problem?
Hamas is a terrorist organization, there's no question. Same applies to Hezbollah. They're brutal, they're fanatical, and we've seen what they do. There's no way that Israel will be able to make any kind of peace with the Hamas. We can make peace with the Palestinian mainstream. My people, the Palestinian shepherds that I'm with, they hate Hamas. And I think that if there are elections in Palestine one of these days, I don't know how that's going to happen. I think there's still a good chance that the Palestinian moderate mainstream will win them. They may try to give the Hamas some form of participation in that thing. That's very likely, I suppose. But I think what we need, we need the Palestinian voices that will begin to reassure ordinary Israelis that it's possible to make peace with these people. Those voices exist. They've been marginalized partly by Israel, largely by Israel. There's a man who's been in jail for the last 20-some years, Marwan Barghouti. So I don't know what he thinks today, but people have said for years that he would be the kind of Palestinian Mandela that would make peace possible. He's not the only such person. I can't tell you how many Palestinian Gandhians I have met, in the level of the villages, the grassroots. Although we're talking about these rather isolated enclaves, they're Palestinians who are Gandhians in the classical Gandhian style. and are capable of voicing that. The Palestinian partner is not dead, far from it. But at the moment, we're fighting the Israeli system, which wants to marginalize all such voices and to maintain a system of severe inequality and criminality. That's the situation today.
I think that we will end here, and I'm thankful to you for ending on a note of hope, and hope that ultimately maybe the Gandhianism will take a place in the Israeli-Palestinian solution. Thank you, David, for being with us today in the morning. Thank you for Rashmi in the morning.
Thank you. Let me just say, as I say goodbye, I make a distinction between optimism and hope. I'm not very optimistic. I think of optimism as a rather shallow mental act, but hope is a spiritual act. And sometimes the worse things are, the more hope there is. We still have hope. Thank you for listening to me.
Thank you, David. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you. Good day.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Yeah, thank you all who have tuned in on Sunday early morning. Just to let you know that next event, which will be